Welcome. We are totally thrilled to be interviewing Grammy-nominated and New Zealand Aotearoa Music Awards shortlisted composer, musician, and academic Justin DeHart. Born in Sacramento, California, Justin specializes in percussive instruments and works in a wide range of contemporary musical styles, from classical to pop and from world to electronica, and has studied many global musical forms, including most recently India. Justin has pretty much worked with everybody in the music industry, with over 100 solo chamber and contemporary music recordings of the likes of the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, various pop legends like Cheap Trick and Stewart Copeland, and all points and places in between. So he's no stranger to the rich diversity of musical forms. Landfall New Zealand Percussion Volume 1 is his latest award-nominated release on Rattle Records. It features pieces by a wide range of New Zealand composers, Glenda Gleam, David Downs, Alex van der Broek, Rosa Elliott, and many more, and Justin himself. So Justin, a very warm welcome to you.
Kia ora. Thanks for having me, Neil.
Can I start with a few very obvious questions first, and then maybe build up to some other things, yeah? So the first question I'd like to ask you, what drew you towards percussive instruments in the first place?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say that when I was a young kid and was presented the opportunity to learn an instrument by my parents, they urged me to consider. And at that time, the saxophone was really big in the 80s. So it was maybe the saxophone, but I saw a friend of mine with some percussion sticks in his back pocket. And I thought that's like a manly instrument, like compared to the piano or even saxophone, which was pretty manly in the 80s. But so it was just kind of a functional, kind of an accident. But as soon as I, got the sticks and started with the drum pad, I just fell in love with it. And I immediately knew that this is what I wanted to do, So yeah, happy accident.
Again, a really obvious question. Who were your musical inspirations and heroes when you were growing up?
Yeah, again, as a child of the 80s, I mean, I grew up with, Michael Jackson and Duran Duran and, all the kind of pop icons of the 80s. As I matured a little bit, I think I went, a little further back into the 70s as a drummer. I was hugely into bands like Rush and Neil Peart and Led Zeppelin. And then as I started getting a little bit more aware of other musics, I got hugely into reggae and the sort of simplicity of the rhythm, and that kind of opened me up into other drumming traditions. So I think I was really born in the pop rock world, and that was my introduction to music and sound. And from there, it just kind of got weirder and more diverse. And, nowadays I would mention people like John Cage and the kinds of gods of percussion music, Steve Reich, Iannis Xenakis, and some of the kind of more experimental side of music. So, yeah.
You mentioned in the introduction, you played with a staggering range of people, yeah? Are there any advantages or disadvantages about switching from genre to genre? So I know you've done classical pieces in jazz. Do they cross-fertilize?
I think so. I'm a firm believer of a generalist approach. I think the days of specialization are frankly over. I mean, if you want to survive these days, it's served me really well to have a kind of a broad range of musical styles to fall back on, if you will. Though it doesn't feel like I'm falling back on them, but in terms of just real mundane, like finding work, and not putting yourself in a corner. People will tend to put you in a box anyways. They'll say, well, you're that guy who does that thing. So you constantly have to fight against that. on one level, it's just simply so I don't get bored. It's really exciting for me. I appreciate the change from going, the break from going from this instrument to that instrument, or this tradition to that tradition. And it's really stimulating for me. And I have these conversations all the time. The knowledge is absolutely transferable. So you learn something from Balinese gamelan music, and you can apply that to rock and roll or some really surprising other kinds of musical styles, and it gives you more references and kind of dialects or languages almost that you can converse in. I've also really appreciated that operating in different styles enables you to interface with different communities. So, I have friends who are, punk rockers, and they might not know much about classical music, though you'd be surprised. And vice versa. I have friends who, play full-time in orchestras and all in between. And I love that just diversity of friendship and cultures that I can kind of dip into.
Yeah, I love that thing about music being like the universal language. And it leads in quite nicely to my next question, which is, I know you studied in India, and India has such a rich musical culture that perhaps isn't as like well known in the West as it should be. Can you tell us a little bit about what you took away from your time there?
Sure. The food is amazing. I was interested in the culture I became interested in the culture for a lot of reasons. The food was one of them. The spirituality, just the richness of faith traditions and depth of history and culture is just amazing. Unbroken culture for, many, many years. And the music and the diversity of music, even with inside of India, is amazing. And then you get down to the specific drums. So I went there to study the South Indian drum, the mridangam, but I had also been studying the tabla, the North Indian drum. And both of them, if you're a drummer, I mean, it's just the rhythmic poetry, it's just fascinating, and it's mind-blowing, and it's fun, it's fun. And it's fun to have that connection with your hands on the drum, and to kind of sit on the ground, and it's not it doesn't make you go deaf like drum sets do. So my takeaway was, obviously just learning about the culture, appreciating the people, seeing concerts, tons and tons of concerts, and really getting a sense of, okay, it's not just this kind of I like everything anymore. Now I can see, oh, well, this is good. This is, this is mediocre. This is fantastic. And appreciating the depth of discipline. And despite my approach to a general approach, in India, they all say that you do one thing, and so that you really concentrate on that one thing and you make that your path, so to speak. And I find that there's a way that both can be true as well. I mean, you need to focus on something if you want to take it somewhere, and to kind of infuse that with a real reverence, to me, was something that I found I could apply also to my other music making, that it doesn't have to be something for work, for a job, or for fun, or for your ego, or for fame, or anything like that, but that actually it can be therapeutic, I guess, in a way. Yeah.
Can I switch track just a little bit, Justin? And you have a new fabulous album, Landfall, which I thoroughly recommend everybody to listen to, which has obviously just been nominated for the New Zealand Music Awards. Can you tell us a little bit about that album in particular and its creation, and maybe what you were thinking about when you were kind of putting it together?
Sure. Playing new music is just a passion of mine. It's kind of what I do these days. I like to be part of that process of birthing new music. I mean, music has to be born at some point, and somebody has to play it for the first time. And that takes a certain kind of curiosity, a certain kind of person, I guess, and I feel really comfortable in that space, or maybe I feel comfortable being uncomfortable in that space, because it's a little bit of a gamble. You don't know what you're going to get. Sometimes you get a really great piece. Sometimes you get, mediocre. Sometimes you get a piece that's not so good. And then the responsibility for me is to try to make it, the best that it can be, and to try to get it to fly is your wish. So when I came here, I moved here in 2017 in Christchurch, and I teach here at the University of Canterbury. And naturally, I started working with students and my colleagues and looking around to see who's making new music, and I'd like to be a part of this. And so this first volume, we called it a volume because I knew it was going to be an ongoing process. There's lots of pieces that I know about that are in existence, and a lot of composers I still like to work with, but many of them have been well recorded. Some of the bigger names that most listeners would know, John Sothis, for instance, Gareth Farr, though both of these composers would be ones that I'm in conversation with now about future volumes. But the first volume was just starting with my colleagues and my community here in Christchurch and in New Zealand in general, the people that I've met that I have an affinity towards their music. And it's just like that, you just say, hey, will you write me a new piece? Or in some instances, they were pieces that hadn't been played. David Downs, I met him in Wellington, and he said he had this marimba piece, and at that point, no one had performed it. So I picked it up and practiced it for a year and, worked on a recording. So yeah, it's just, I'm dependent on this ecosystem of composers and audience members. And this was my attempt to say, hey, look what's happening, and try to generate some excitement.
Are there any particular thematic linking threads in the pieces in the album? I was thinking like the sense of purpose, like the piece like Rule 81 has very direct meaning, and others are more, I guess you'd call them more musical and oblique in that way that music is not like a direct message, but is a deep emotional impact.
Yeah, I wasn't able to purposely kind of create a thread with the pieces. They were, in the end, a collection of pieces. There's some things that ties them together. I mean, the obvious one being that they're solo pieces that I've played. There are some little, if you listen carefully, you'll hear some little instruments that might show up in a few different pieces that are similar sounds. But you'll probably notice that the album is fairly diverse. I mean, there's a marimba solo on there. There's a kind of a drum solo thing, a few of those. One of them is just played kind of with my fingers and my brushes. There's an kind of piece with stones and electronics. So the sound worlds are very, very, very different. I think that reflects the idiom, of percussion, which is very diverse. And I'm not a marimba soloist per se, so it's shows what the kinds of things that I really like. But thematically, no, there's nothing that puts it together. I have to say, it's funny with the Spotify playlist that was put out with the music awards, and you get these pop music and stuff, and then all of a sudden it comes to Landfall, piece by Rosa Elliott, which is a gorgeous piece. But I can just imagine the people's reaction when you get there, because time just kind of stops, and you kind of just enter this whole other universe of like, what's going on here, and it's very pleasant, but it's very different than a lot of music that we're used to listening to.
I know what you mean. I think classical music, one of the things it can do is play about with the nature of time and the way it interacts with your thoughts. New Zealand musical culture has its own very rich collection of percussive instruments and treasures, tango poro, distinctively non-Western approaches and ethos to the usage. Can you tell us about your discovery of this sound world and how it affected you?
Yeah, it was one of the reasons I was attracted to come here, is just also just my curiosity of culture, and to learn about the culture, the cultures, I suppose, in this part of the world. As you're probably aware, in Tangapuro, there's not a whole lot of drums. There are quite a few percussion instruments, and presently, this is kind of what I'm learning about now. I'll be studying some te reo in the early next year, and I'm starting to talk more seriously with some musicians about their experience. I'm commissioning some carvers to make me some instruments, and doing some study about that. And there's a lot of connections that I can draw with my own practice, which is the love of sounds from nature, and the idea of found sounds. So not going to the store necessarily and paying, thousands of dollars for a Steinway piano, but seeing what you can make out of something you might find on the beach. And the sounds, that you can make with that are much more, in my opinion, much more, evocative of nature. There's something really powerful and unique about each one of those instruments and the sounds. So I'm personally really fascinated. There's obviously rich culture in our neighborhood and drumming traditions in the Cook Islands, for instance. And these are things that I don't know about, and I'm excited to learn more about. It's kind of where I'm at now, just trying to broaden and dig in, really. Yeah.
Can I talk about, or ask you about the balance between emotion and intellect in pieces of music? I mean, classical music in particular, the balance between emotion and intellect, I think, is really important in a piece. And I was wondering how you go about trying to achieve that balance.
Yeah, I think this is it's a really interesting question that you ask. I think it's something that those of us in academia, I guess I'll kind of put it in quotations, because I don't see myself sort of sitting in academia, but after all, I do. But it's often people say, okay, the music you're playing is intellectual, so, well, what does that mean? Does that mean it's thought-provoking? Does that mean somebody thought about it when they wrote it? So I think it tends to have this idea that it's devoid of emotion, and I think that that's incorrect. Actually, I know what people are talking about. There's some pieces that are very dry, and they're very, I'm not sure if intellectual is the right word. It's very dry, I suppose. It's very, I don't know, mathematical or something like that. But even with a lot of these pieces that might be created, let's say, mathematically or statistically, I find that, and I think this is one of John Cage's discoveries too, is that the listener will interpret that and put their own meaning onto it. And as the interpreter, as the performer, I'm the conduit. So I can play the music very sort of dry and try to evoke that if I want to. And sometimes that's cool, because there's something cool about dryness sometimes, like the desert or whatever. There's a beauty there. On the other hand, I have the opportunity to put my own meaning into it. And I see that's the role of an interpreter. So it's my job I see it as my job to pull from my own resources about what this can mean. Is it about struggle? Is it about on a very basic level, is it about tension or release? But you could create your own story. That's what's really cool. Some composers will have their own story about the piece, and you can pull that in and try to use that. But I think one of the secrets to performance, I'm not sure if all performers will agree with me, but is to have your own kind of story about the piece that you might not be able to put it into words. So this is where the emotion comes in. It's an emotion that you might evoke when you're playing a piece, and it might be a color or a landscape or a mood or a feeling in your gut or something like that. So I don't think that intellectual music is necessarily opposed to emotional music. I think emotion is something that's very basic, and we all want that in music. Now, one interesting point of difference is where you have functional harmony and not. So when we listen to the radio, or a lot of classical music for that matter, it's using harmony in a way that's actually affects our emotions, right? It makes us excited, it brings us down. And frankly, sometimes I feel manipulated, like not in a good way. When I listen to music like that, sometimes it's fun to go on the ride, but then sometimes I feel like, hey, leave me alone. I want to have my own, take my own, take my own idea about the piece. So I often am drawn to pieces that are not functionally tonal in a harmonic sense, that sort of are predictably will take you from a kind of a home base to a kind of a nearby destination, and then kind of bring you back. I mean, that's great. It always works and it's beautiful, and you can do that without functional harmony. But that's something that I find is, how can you find those even more subtle zones, emotional zones that are perhaps more open to interpretation for the listener.
I've been thinking about the digital technology, and it strikes me that music has now kind of reached the point where visual art perhaps reached in the 70s, 80s, and that it's now become an endless world of possibilities. There's infinite. You can do anything with sound you want now. There is no limit, and also relatively affordable as well. How do you navigate that suddenly explosion of infinite possibilities when creating music?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. I mean, I, like everyone else, I hear this, well, I don't know everyone else, but when I listen to what's new and what people are doing with electronics, for instance, I love it. I mean, it's not all good. There's some people doing some really fantastic stuff. And, there's some mediocre stuff, and it's subjective. And part of me jumps in and, gets some software, and I have some synthesizers, and I do it myself. At the end of the day, it's kind of hard to do, everything, and to do it very well. And and again, not to sort of stick on John Cage, but he kind of said this, in the 1930s, I think, that percussion is the transition from keyboard influenced music, functional equal temperament music, to a future music where all sounds are possible. And that's what you're referring to with electronic music. You can use any sound. So to me, I think that actually that evolution happened so quickly that percussion kind of had a quick little heyday, and then it got sort of ran over by electronics. But then that's why the novelty of percussion is still actually slightly relative, because people are still kind of catching up on what is percussion. I just heard today that a couple of my colleagues in the United States, some percussion quartets, 2 percussion quartets are nominated for Grammys this year. So this, percussion is still new to a lot of people. It's exciting, and it embraces that world of all sounds, which to me is exciting, because that's what reflects our nature, right? When you step outside, you don't hear Mozart, you hear the trees blowing, you hear cars coming by, and it's sounds and noise. And I think of noise not in a pejorative, but in a beautiful way. So how do I navigate it? I try to jump in, and I primarily use percussion. I do toy around with electronics, and I make my own beats, and I do some recordings and pop music, but I consume electronic music. I listened to your release, by the way. I really enjoyed what you're doing with electronics and sampling and all the kinds of sounds that you have in there. It's gorgeous what people can do, and I celebrate it all.
Within this new universe, this is a linked question. Where does percussive music sit? I'm thinking about the overlap between acoustic percussion and electronic percussion. And also you were talking about Reich and how album drumming, and you use real drummers, but you could actually recreate that album really simply now using digital technology and sequencers.
It's true. I think you're right. You can do that. And some of the early, Steve Reich came up with that idea with tape machines, right? So he's doing 2 tape reels, and then one started kind of going slowly out of phase with the other one. And then I don't know if it was the devil inside, but he thought, well, what would happen if the musicians could do this, you know? And so this was an experiment, and a radical one. And I think perhaps we've always, music always reflects, you know, the environment. So as technology progresses, composers are in turn also being influenced by that. There's lots of percussion pieces now that, let's say, have evoke sounds of, you know, drum and bass, or, you know, different kinds of modern music style, sampling, for example. So, but I think, and this is not a criticism on electronic music, but there is something that's nice about, first of all, the human touch, the human imperfections, you know, the little the little things that we can't do quite like a robot. I think that's has its, you know, it's interesting for us, you know, we kind of celebrate those little things, and also the acoustics, because when you have sound coming out of a speaker, it acts in a very different way than sound does when it's on an acoustic instrument, and it's kind of bouncing off the walls. And when I've heard Steve Reich's music live, I really recommend people to seek that out, because it's great to put on your headphones and listen to that music and it sounds great, but hearing it live is a whole nother experience, because the sound is bouncing off the walls, and you know, you're sharing that it's a communal experience, you're sharing with other audience members, and it's rich in a whole nother way. So I don't see the danger of, you know, acoustic music being replaced, and I see that as my role in part is to say, well, yeah, I can perform, you know, I practiced and I've sort of got to a certain level of performing, so this is how I can contribute.
Are all the pieces in Landfall acoustic?
Oh, they are all acoustic, minus the very last one, Braided Plain Sound Walk, is it's performed live, but it's performed. So I'm playing 2 stones from a river. I have 2 microphones that I sort of are processing the sound in different ways, and then there's a electronics operator, in this case my colleague and the composer Ruben de la Tour. So he has created this kind of a sophisticated max patch, where depending on which mic I'm in and which sort of section he's in, it's processing the sound live and coming out of the speakers. And in fact, the thing that you wouldn't get on the CD, unfortunately, is that he's put it in a quadraphonic sound. So if you're able to catch it live sometime, that's quite cool to hear these sounds kind of swim around you. And it's really beautiful what he's done with just that fairly limited sound world of the stones and what he can do with it. So that would be a live electronic piece, but the rest of them were all done live.
Can I ask a fanboy question? I really loved The Police, and I really like Stewart Copeland's work after he left The Police, like these soundtrack for Rumblefish and stuff like that. What was it like to work with Stewart Copeland?
Oh, it's great. I mean, he's as you might expect, you know, he kind of, I think my reading of him is that he lives in a kind of another alternative universe, you know, just experiencing the fame that he has, and also just personality. He's just a very lively kind of punk rock guy, you know. And I made the mistake of saying that that I actually, so I played with him for a couple of his compositions, and he composes classical music, and he composed some percussion music, and he himself played with us. So in fact, at one point he's playing the drums and I'm right next to him playing the bass marimba. And I thought, hey, this is kind of like, I kind of feel like I'm Sting, on the stage playing the bass and he's playing the drums, But I made the mistake of saying, oh yeah, I like, this kind of got some cool jazz elements. And he says, I hate jazz, But he was very, very easy to work with. And what I really came to appreciate from him, which you wouldn't know if you just listened to the albums, is that he's always reinventing himself. So he rarely will play it the same way twice. If you've ever seen the Police live, you will have noticed that too. He doesn't do the same drum fills every time. He switches them up. And I appreciate that. That's just, it's fresh. And that kind of energy, he's kind of wild, but really, yeah, I think that's why he's had the success he's had, I think, yeah.
When you play, do you go really on sound through the ears or vibration through the body as a percussionist? Yeah,
that's a good question. I try not to be too much in my head, when you perform, because that's just kind of dangerous. You can start to, it's too close to the brain, and then you start to overthink things. So, but I think listening is, of course, it's paramount, and I think when you start to, like I said, if you start to overthink things, so by the time I get on stage to perform, it's almost like, I'm not sure if it's listening, it's almost imagination. You're trying to play what you hear, maybe like a millisecond before you play. So you're trying to follow, at least what I aspire to do often is to try to follow my idea of the sound that I want to make. So, and then you make the sound, and then of course you're sort of reacting to that always, especially in an ensemble situation. If you're in an ensemble, then you're listening like crazy. It's like a hyper listening where you're trying to almost anticipate. It's something that I think music really is special about music. It's not just the technique and the kind of craft of your instrument, but it's actually developing that really sharp concentration and listening skill that puts you right in the moment and allows you to sort of connect. So the vibration thing, yeah, I try to be grounded. So that comes with it means, for me, it means playing with your whole body. And percussive is very physical anyways, but it means, kind of bending my knees a little bit, trying to kind of have a solid footing and to play with your, play with your whole body. And you'll see, let's say, younger percussionists when they start off and they're kind of disembodied. They come up to the instrument and they kind of stand there and then they kind of play the instrument. And they're playing with their hands and their arms and they're probably thinking something, but they're not investing 100% their whole, all of the cells of their body. So yeah, I try to embody the sound as much as possible.
You've been nominated for a Grammy. You're up for the Best Classical Artist Award at the New Zealand Aotearoa Music Awards this year. Can you tell us a little bit about how it feels to be nominated for all these prestigious awards? And do you think these awards actually help in getting your work noticed by a wider audience?
Well, they absolutely do help to get to a wider audience. I'm kind of, I try to hold my excitement back sometimes with these things because, first of all, you don't know if you're going to win and you don't want to disappoint yourself. And after all, it's not about winning, is it? It's about sharing your music and getting other people and having other people hear it. But actually, recently, I was thinking about this recent nomination and what its potential is. And I have to say, it's nice that these things exist because it does allow people to think twice about what is music and to recognize it. And especially in today's age, music comes out. Like as we're speaking, there's probably a dozen, albums that have come out, perhaps even here in New Zealand. So it's just music is just coming out, a lot of really great stuff. And you can't recognize everybody, but to have these awards is saying, look, there's an organization, and we as a culture appreciate music, we appreciate the arts, and we want to think twice about it, and we want to recognize pieces that we think are, you know, outstanding for one reason or another. So I think that's great. And from my perspective, it's really interesting to see the people around me, because of course people get excited about it, you know, and they want to congratulate you, and they want to be proud, and all the people who are part of it can celebrate it together. So it's an absolute honor. I mean, I just feel extremely lucky, really. I don't feel it's just the synergy of this wouldn't have happened without my colleagues and the composers, the support of the record label, it just, you know, the list goes on. So it feels great. It feels really cool. I feel also really happy for all the people who have gotten nominated, and including the people in the category that I am. And I, you know, just think it's great that everybody gets their project out there for a second time, and people might go check it out if they've missed it on the first one.
Justin, a huge thank you for letting us interview you about your practice and talking to us about your musical life and work. Landfall is a great album, and I thoroughly recommend everybody has a listen to it. And good luck in upcoming awards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's a pleasure talking to you.